Right here in America, during the Second World War, there were thousands of German soldiers walking around Texas, Colorado, and Montana, not as prisoners locked behind bars, but as working cowboys. Yeah, you heard that right. German POWs, men who'd been fighting against us just months before, were suddenly learning to rope cattle, mend fences, and ride horses across the American West. And here's the kicker: many of them never wanted to leave. This is a story that doesn't get told nearly enough, and when you hear what actually happened, you'll understand why it changed lives on both sides. We're talking about enemy soldiers who arrived expecting to be treated as harshly as they'd heard Americans could be, only to find themselves sitting down to home-cooked meals with ranching families, square dancing on Saturday nights, and forming friendships that would last the rest of their lives. This wasn't some propaganda effort or staged event. This was real life, happening in small towns across America while the war still raged overseas. So how did we end up with German prisoners working alongside American ranchers? Well, it all started with a massive problem that nobody saw coming. When America entered World War II after Pearl Harbor, something happened that changed everything on the home front. Suddenly, every able-bodied young man was either enlisting or getting drafted. Farms and ranches across the country found themselves without workers. Now you've got to understand, ranching isn't like other jobs where you can just shut down for a few years and pick back up later. Cattle need feeding every single day. Fences break. Calves are born. The work never stops, war or no war. The ranchers were desperate. Some of them were older men who'd built their spreads over decades, and now they were trying to do the work of 5 or 6 people all by themselves. Wives and daughters pitched in, absolutely, but there's only so much a couple of people can do when you've got hundreds or thousands of acres to manage. Meanwhile, across the ocean, American and Allied forces were capturing German soldiers by the tens of thousands. After the North Africa campaign, after Sicily, after D-Day, we had so many POWs that we literally didn't know what to do with them all. Britain was already stretched thin, couldn't house them, so America agreed to take them. By the end of the war, we had over 400,000 German POWs scattered across camps in nearly every state in the Union. Now here's where it gets interesting. The Geneva Convention, which set the rules for how prisoners of war should be treated, said that POWs could be put to work as long as the work wasn't related to the war effort and they were paid for it. The government started doing the math. We've got all these prisoners sitting idle, and we've got desperate labor shortages in agriculture. Why not put 2 and 2 together? At first there was resistance. You can understand why. These were the enemy after all. Many Americans had sons, brothers, fathers fighting overseas. The idea of German soldiers working on American soil didn't sit well with everyone, but necessity has a way of changing minds. The ranchers needed help or they'd lose everything. The government needed to do something with these prisoners, and the prisoners themselves. Most of them were just young men who'd been conscripted, who'd never wanted to fight in the first place, and who were actually relieved to be out of the war. The first group started arriving at ranches in 1943. The guards would bring them out in trucks early in the morning, and you can only think what must have been going through everyone's minds. The ranchers were sizing up these former enemy soldiers, wondering if they'd know a cow from a cactus. The German boys, most of them barely in their 20s, were stepping out onto land so vast and open that it must have seemed like another planet. Remember, many of these guys came from cities in Germany, or from small farms where everything was tidy and compact. The American West was something else entirely. One rancher in Texas later recalled the first morning his German POWs arrived. He said he looked at these skinny kids in their prison uniforms and thought there was no way they'd make it through a single day of ranch work. But he needed hands, so he showed them what to do, started them on simple tasks, mending fences, hauling feed. Within a week, he said, those boys were working harder than any hired hands he'd ever had. They were desperate to prove themselves, to show they weren't lazy, weren't what the propaganda had made Germans out to be. Here's something that might surprise you. The POWs were paid for their work. 80 cents a day, which doesn't sound like much, but in the camp system, that money could buy cigarettes, toiletries, even beer. More than that, though, the work gave them purpose. Sitting in a camp all day with nothing to do except think about the war, about home, about family you might never see again, that'll drive a man crazy. Getting up before dawn, riding out to check on cattle, coming back bone-tired but with the satisfaction of a hard day's work, that kept them sane. The transformation that happened wasn't instant, but it was real. These German boys started learning the rhythms of ranch life. They learned that you don't approach a horse from behind unless you want to get kicked. They learned how to spot when a cow is about to calve. They learned the 100 little skills that make the difference between a good ranch hand and someone who's just taking up space. And something else happened too, something nobody really expected. They started forming relationships with the ranchers and their families. Now this wasn't universal. Some ranchers kept their distance, treated the POWs strictly as workers and nothing more. Can't blame them for that. But on other ranches, especially the more isolated ones where the same POWs came back day after day, week after week, things started to shift. The ranchers realized these weren't monsters. These were just kids, really, who'd been caught up in something bigger than themselves. Many of them hated Hitler, hated the Nazis, had been forced to fight. One story that really captures this comes from a ranch in Montana. There was a German POW named Heinrich, early 20s, who'd been a university student before the war. He'd studied literature, of all things, and here he was shoveling manure and branding cattle. The rancher's wife noticed he was always reading during breaks, sometimes books in German that he'd gotten through the camp library. She started talking to him about what he was reading. She'd been a teacher before marrying the rancher. They got to discussing poetry, philosophy, things that had nothing to do with the war. One evening, Heinrich stayed a bit late to help fix a gate that had broken. The rancher's wife invited him in for supper. Now, this was technically against the rules. The guards were supposed to take the POWs back to camp at the end of the workday, but the guards had gotten comfortable too. They knew these particular prisoners weren't going to cause trouble. Where would they even run to? So Heinrich sat down at that kitchen table, and the rancher's wife served him pot roast and potatoes and green beans, and they talked. The rancher asked Heinrich about his family back in Germany. Heinrich told them about his mother, who ran a bakery, and his younger sister who wanted to be a nurse. That night broke something open. After that, Heinrich became almost like part of the family. On Sundays, when there was no work, the rancher would sometimes bring Heinrich back to the ranch anyway, and they'd spend the day just talking, or the rancher would teach him something new about horses or cattle. The rancher's wife would pack extra food for Heinrich to take back to share with the other POWs. When Heinrich's birthday came around, she baked him a cake. Can you even comprehend that? Here's this German soldier, and this American woman is baking him a birthday cake, while her own son is overseas fighting Germans. But that's what happened in these small moments of grace that war couldn't quite stamp out. And Heinrich wasn't unique. All across the West, similar stories were playing out. In Colorado, there was a group of POWs who became so good at their ranch work that when the war ended and it was time for them to be repatriated to Germany, the ranchers they'd worked for threw them a farewell party. A party for German POWs. There was food and music, and some of the local women even came, and they square danced together, Germans and Americans, in a barn while the sun set over the mountains. The Germans taught their American hosts some of their own songs and traditions. Christmas was especially poignant. Many of the POWs had been away from home for years by this point. They'd missed multiple Christmases with their families. The ranchers noticed how melancholy they got as the holiday approached. Some of the ranching families started inviting POWs to their Christmas celebrations. There are photographs from the time, faded now, showing German prisoners sitting around American Christmas trees, holding cups of cocoa, sometimes with their arms around the ranchers' kids. Now, not everyone approved. There were townspeople who thought this fraternization went too far. You'd hear complaints in the local stores, at church socials. How could these ranchers be so friendly with the enemy? Didn't they know what the Germans had done in Europe? And those were fair questions, honestly. The war was real. The atrocities were real. But the ranchers who got to know these particular Germans saw individuals, not just a uniform enemy. They saw boys who cried when they got letters from home, or who went silent with grief when months passed with no word, and they didn't know if their families were even alive. One particularly moving story comes from a ranch near the Texas-Mexico border. There was a German POW named Kurt who'd been a carpenter before the war. The ranch house had been built decades earlier and was falling apart in places. Kurt started fixing things in his spare time, not because anyone asked him to, but because he couldn't stand seeing shoddy workmanship. He rebuilt the front porch, fixed the roof in the barn, built a proper henhouse for the rancher's wife. She'd been complaining for years that the chickens kept getting taken by coyotes. The rancher was so impressed that he started paying Kurt extra out of his own pocket for the carpentry work. By the end of the war, Kurt had essentially rebuilt half the ranch. But more than that, he'd become someone the rancher trusted completely. There's a letter that survived, written by the rancher to his son who was serving in the Pacific. In it, he talks about Kurt. He says something like, "I know he's supposed to be the enemy, but I'd trust him with my life. He's a good man caught in a bad situation, just like a lot of folks." The rancher's son wrote back, and his response was complicated. He said he understood, but it was hard for him to think of Germans as anything but the enemy when he was out there fighting them. That tension was real. How do you hold both truths at once? That the German military machine was doing terrible things, but that individual German soldiers could be decent human beings. It's not an easy thing to reconcile, and different people came to different conclusions. As the war dragged on, something else started happening. The German POWs were getting news from home, and it wasn't good. Cities were being bombed to rubble. Family members were dying. The Soviet army was advancing from the east, and everyone knew that occupation by the Soviets was something to be feared. Some of the POWs started to realize they might actually be better off as prisoners in America than they would be going home to what was left of Germany. There was one particular moment that several POWs and ranchers later talked about. It was April 1945 when news came through that Hitler was dead and Germany had surrendered. You'd think the POWs would be celebrating or at least relieved. Instead, many of them were terrified. What now? Germany was divided, occupied. If they were sent back to the Soviet zone, God only knew what would happen to them. And what about their families? Communications were cut off in many areas. The POWs had no way of knowing if their loved ones had survived. The ranchers saw their workers going through this emotional turmoil. Some of them tried to help. There were ranchers who wrote letters to their congressmen, asking if there was any way the German POWs who'd worked for them could stay in America. These requests were almost always denied. The official policy was repatriation. But the fact that American ranchers were even making these requests tells you everything about the bonds that had formed. The repatriation process started in 1945 and continued into 1946. The POWs were gathered up from the ranches and farms where they'd been working, sent back to the camps, and then gradually shipped back to Germany. The farewells were harder than anyone expected. There are accounts of ranchers' wives crying as the trucks took the POWs away. Of ranchers shaking hands with men they'd worked beside for 2 or 3 years, pressing extra money into their hands, addresses written on scraps of paper with promises to write. And they did write. For years afterward, letters went back and forth across the Atlantic. The POWs, now back in a devastated Germany, would write about trying to rebuild their lives. They'd send thanks for the kindness they'd been shown, reminisce about their time on the ranches. The ranchers would write back with news about the cattle, the weather, life on the ranch. Some of these correspondences lasted for decades. A few of the Germans eventually made it back to America as immigrants, and went to visit the ranches where they'd worked as prisoners. Those reunions were something special. Heinrich, that German POW from Montana who'd studied literature, kept in touch with the rancher's wife for over 30 years. When she passed away in the late 1970s, Heinrich flew to America for her funeral. He stood there in that small Montana cemetery and gave a eulogy that had everyone in tears. He talked about how she'd treated him like a human being when he'd felt like the world had decided he was something less than that. How she'd given him books to read and hope to hold on to during the darkest time of his life. Kurt, the carpenter from Texas, did manage to immigrate to America in the 1950s. He didn't go back to the ranch where he'd worked, though. That would have been too complicated, maybe too painful. But he settled in Texas, started his own carpentry business, and built a good life. Before he died, he told his children and grandchildren about his time as a POW, about the rancher who'd treated him fairly and the work that had kept him sane during the war. There's another layer to this story that doesn't get talked about much. What did this experience do to the German POW's understanding of America? Remember, these men had been fed Nazi propaganda about Americans. They'd been told Americans were weak, decadent, that they had no stomach for real work or real war. Then they got here and found themselves on ranches with men who worked from dawn to dusk, who were tough as leather, who built their lives with their own two hands in some of the harshest country on earth. The contrast between the propaganda and the reality was stark. Many of the POWs later said that their time working on American ranches completely changed their worldview. They saw American democracy in action, small-scale and personal. They saw how communities worked together, how neighbors helped each other during hard times. They experienced American generosity firsthand. When they went back to Germany, they carried those experiences with them. And some historians believe that the POW program actually helped lay groundwork for better German-American relations after the war. Think about that for a second. The official diplomacy, the Marshall Plan, the reconstruction of West Germany, all of that mattered enormously. But there were also these thousands of individual relationships, these small moments of human connection between former enemies that helped heal the divide. The German who learned to ride a horse from a Texas rancher, the American farm wife who taught a German prisoner how to make apple pie. These tiny threads of understanding that, woven together, created something stronger than hatred. Not every story had a happy ending, of course. Some POWs went back to Germany and were never heard from again. Some probably wanted to forget their time as prisoners entirely, even if it had been relatively pleasant. The shame of defeat, of having been captured, was real for many of them, and some of the ranchers eventually had second thoughts about how friendly they'd been. As more information came out about the Holocaust and the full extent of Nazi atrocities, some Americans felt guilty about the kindness they'd shown to German soldiers. That's a complicated moral space to occupy. Can you hate the regime but have compassion for the individual soldier? Should you? These questions don't have easy answers. What we can say is that the ranchers and the POWs who formed genuine connections seemed to find something valuable in those relationships, something that transcended the political and military conflict of the war. There's a museum in Texas now, in one of the towns where POWs were stationed, that has exhibits about this period. You can go and see photographs of German prisoners working on ranches, smiling for the camera alongside their American hosts. You can read letters that were saved, see the handmade Christmas decorations that POWs crafted in the camps. There are oral histories recorded in the 1980s and 90s with the surviving POWs and ranchers, preserving their memories before that generation passed away entirely. One of the most touching items in the museum is a saddle. It's worn and old now, but it's been preserved carefully. It belonged to a rancher in West Texas, and carved into the leather are initials. The rancher's initials, and below them, carved with equal care, the initials of a German POW who worked for him for nearly 3 years. After the war, After the German had gone home, the rancher couldn't bring himself to get rid of that saddle or to sand away those initials. His family donated it to the museum after he passed away, and now it sits there as this physical reminder of an unlikely friendship forged during wartime. The whole phenomenon of German POWs becoming cowboys is one of those historical quirks that seems almost too strange to be true, but it happened. It happened because of circumstance, because of necessity, because individuals on both sides made choices to see each other as human beings rather than just as enemy combatants. The war created the situation, but the people involved created the relationships. You have to wonder what those POWs thought when they first arrived in places like Montana or Wyoming or West Texas, seeing landscapes so different from anything in Germany. The sheer scale of it, the endless sky, the isolation. Some of the ranches were so remote that the nearest town was 50 miles away. For a German from a crowded European city, this must have been both terrifying and liberating. All that space, all that silence. And the cowboys themselves, the ranchers, what did they make of these German boys learning to rope and ride? There's a certain poetry to it, isn't there? The American cowboy is such an iconic figure, representing freedom and independence and the wide-open frontier. And here were these German soldiers, who'd been conscripted into one of the most rigid, authoritarian military machines in history, learning to embody those cowboy values. Learning to trust their own judgment out on the range, to make decisions without someone barking orders at them, to take pride in work done well. Several of the POWs later said that their time on the ranches taught them more than just practical skills. It taught them about self-reliance, about dignity in labor, about the satisfaction of being responsible for something real and tangible. One former POW, interviewed in the 1980s, said that branding his first calf successfully felt like a bigger accomplishment than anything he'd done in the German army, because it was constructive instead of destructive. Because he was helping something grow instead of tearing things down. The cultural exchange went both ways too. The Germans brought their own traditions and skills. Some of them were excellent with machinery and helped ranchers fix equipment that had been limping along for years. Others introduced different techniques for various farm tasks. There was even some exchange of music. German folk songs were taught to curious Americans, and the Germans learned American country and Western songs. Can you even think about that? These German prisoners sitting around in a bunkhouse, teaching themselves to play Home on the Range on a harmonica. The food was another point of connection. Ranch cooking was hearty and simple, and the POWs generally appreciated it, especially compared to what they'd been eating before capture. But they missed their own food too, and sometimes ranchers' wives would let them try to recreate German dishes with whatever ingredients were available. It didn't always work out, but the effort meant something. On one ranch in Colorado, a German POW managed to make something approximating a black forest cake for the rancher's daughter's birthday. She remembered that cake for the rest of her life, talked about it in an interview when she was in her 70s, how special it had made her feel. The whole experience raises interesting questions about identity and loyalty. These POWs were technically still members of the German military, even in captivity. Some of them still believed in Germany, even if they'd lost faith in Hitler and the Nazis. How did they reconcile that with growing affection for America and Americans? For some, it wasn't a conflict. They could appreciate the kindness they were shown without betraying their homeland. For others, it was more complicated. There are accounts of POWs who became so enamored with America that they felt guilty about it, like they were betraying their families back home. And then there were the practical considerations. The POWs knew the war would end eventually. They knew they'd have to go home. Getting too attached to their American hosts, to their American lives, would only make that eventual separation harder. Some of them tried to keep their distance emotionally, even while working closely with the ranchers every day. Others couldn't help themselves and dove into the relationships fully, knowing they'd pay for it with heartbreak later. The end of the war brought all these tensions to a head. The repatriation wasn't immediate. Some POWs remained in America working on ranches and farms well into 1946. This strange liminal period where the war was over but they weren't free to go home yet. They weren't free to stay. They were just in this in-between state. Some of them used that time to learn English better, to study, to prepare themselves for whatever came next. Others just tried to savor their remaining time in America, knowing they might never see these places or these people again. When the ships finally came to take them back to Germany, it must have been surreal. They were going from these wide-open spaces, these ranches where they'd had purpose and respect, back to a Germany that lay in ruins. Many of them arrived to find their hometowns destroyed, their families scattered or dead. The contrast between the America they'd known as prisoners and the Germany they returned to as citizens was devastating for many of them. Some of the POWs who'd worked on ranches actually had an easier time in the post-war chaos because of the skills they'd learned. They knew how to work hard, how to rebuild, how to make do with limited resources. They'd learned resilience from the ranchers, whether consciously or not. And for those who'd gone back to Soviet-controlled areas, the experience of having been in America, of having worked with Americans, could be dangerous. They had to be careful about what they said, what they shared about their experiences. But the ones who'd ended up in West Germany, in the American occupation zone, sometimes found that their POW experience was an asset. They could speak English. They understood Americans. They could serve as translators or liaisons. Some of them parlayed this into careers, into opportunities that helped them and their families survive and eventually thrive in the post-war years. Back in America, the ranches returned to normal, or tried to. The young men came home from the war and took up their work again. The desperate labor shortage eased. Life went on. But the ranchers who'd worked with the POWs never quite forgot them. There'd be moments out on the range when something would remind them of one of the German boys. A particular way of mending a fence, a joke someone had told, a song that had been sung. These small ghosts of memory that persisted. Some of the ranchers felt changed by the experience. They'd gone into it thinking of the POWs as the enemy, as necessary labor, as a solution to a problem. They came out of it having learned something about the complexity of war, about the humanity that persists even in conflict, about their own capacity for compassion and connection across enormous divides. Not all of them would have put it in those terms, but you can see it in the letters they wrote, in the stories their families preserved. This whole chapter of American history almost got lost. It wasn't the kind of story that fit neatly into the standard World War II narrative. It was too complicated, too human, too small-scale. Big history focuses on battles and politics and movements of armies. This was individual people making individual choices in very specific circumstances. But those small stories matter. They tell us things about who we are and who we can be that the big stories sometimes miss. The German POWs who became cowboys, who learned to love the American West, who formed friendships with the very people they'd been at war with, they showed that even in the worst of times, there's room for grace. The ranchers who took a chance on these prisoners, who treated them fairly and sometimes with real kindness, they showed that fear and hatred don't have to be the final word. And together, prisoners and ranchers, they created something unexpected and strangely beautiful in the middle of the most destructive war in human history. So when you think about World War II, when you think about German soldiers and American civilians, think about this too. Think about young German men learning to sit a horse properly, to read the weather, to work cattle under the enormous western sky. Think about American ranchers seeing past the uniform to the person underneath. Think about the letters written across an ocean, the friendships maintained across decades, the small acts of kindness that echoed forward through time. That's part of the story too, and it deserves to be remembered.